At 1:51 in the morning on June 6, 1944, a stick of American paratroopers dropped out of the dark sky over a small French town, and one of them simply vanished. His squad mates hit the ground, gathered their gear, and started searching for him in the smoke and gunfire. He wasn't there. Not in the field. Not in the hedgerows. Not among the wounded being dragged to cover. For the men of the 82nd Airborne, he was just gone. One more name that might never make it off a landing zone that was already turning into a slaughterhouse. What none of them knew was that he was 12 meters above their heads, hanging in plain sight, pretending to be dead. His name was John Marvin Steele. He was 31 years old, older than almost every man in his unit, which is why the other paratroopers called him Pop. He came from Metropolis, Illinois, a river town on the Ohio, where his father piloted freight boats and his mother raised 7 children in a wooden house near the water. Steele had dropped out of college, drifted toward a trade as a barber, and then, when the war came, walked into a recruiting station like thousands of other men his age. He didn't do it halfway. Steele volunteered for the paratroopers, one of the most dangerous jobs in the U.S. Army. And by the time Normandy came around, he already had 2 combat jumps behind him. Sicily, where he broke a leg on landing, and the invasion of Italy near Salerno. He was assigned to Company F, 2nd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the legendary 82nd Airborne Division. On the night of June 5th, he boarded a C-47 bound for the Cotentin Peninsula with hundreds of other aircraft, part of the largest airborne assault ever attempted. His target was a drop zone west of a small town called Sainte-Mère-Église. He would never reach it. Sainte-Mère-Église should have been asleep. Instead, a stray incendiary bomb had set a house near the town square on fire earlier that night, and the church bell was ringing to call out a bucket brigade. Villagers and German soldiers were standing shoulder to shoulder in the square, fighting the blaze together, when the drone of aircraft engines rose over the rooftops. 2 plane loads of American paratroopers, dropped in error, came down almost directly on top of the town. It was a death trap. Men floated into a lit square full of armed Germans, unable to steer, unable to fight back until their boots touched ground. Several were killed before they ever landed. Steele's own stick was caught in the same disaster. His parachute snagged on one of the stone pinnacles of the church tower. The lines pulled taut, and he was left dangling against the side of the building, high above the square, wounded by a burst of flak in the foot. Below him, German rifles cracked. Above him, church bells rang out over the chaos he could not escape. Steele reached for his knife to cut himself free. It slipped from his hand and fell to the cobblestones far below. He was stuck. Not hidden, not safe. Completely exposed, hanging from a church steeple in the middle of a firefight, close enough to hear German soldiers shouting orders in the square beneath him. There was only one thing left to do. He let his body go slack. He dropped his head. He stopped moving. For the paratroopers still fighting on the ground, and for the rest of his unit scattered across the Norman countryside, John Steele had disappeared. No one saw where he landed. No one knew if he'd made it down alive, been shot in the air, or drowned in one of the flooded fields the Germans had deliberately created to kill men like him. In the confusion of that first hour, he was simply unaccounted for, one of hundreds of paratroopers who would not answer to their name that morning. Steele hung there for 2 hours. 2 hours of pretending to be a corpse while a battle raged beneath him. 2 hours of gunfire, shouting, the smell of smoke, and the constant fear that the next burst of fire would find him for real. Every part of his training told him to move, to fight, to do something, and every part of his judgment told him that the moment he did, he was dead. So he did nothing. He hung limp against the church wall and waited. Eventually, German soldiers noticed him. At first, they assumed he was another body among the dead paratroopers littering the square. They were ready to leave him there. But someone decided he might be carrying useful papers or equipment, and a soldier climbed up to cut him down. The instant they lowered him to the ground, the truth came out. John Steele was alive. he was taken prisoner. For his squad, this changed nothing. They still had no idea what had happened to him. As far as the survivors of Company F knew, Steele was missing, one name in a long list of paratroopers who couldn't be located after the drop. Some of those names would turn out to be dead. Some would turn out to be scattered miles from their objective, fighting with strangers from other units. And some, like Steele, were now behind enemy lines in German hands, their fate unknown to anyone wearing an American uniform. The Germans, meanwhile, were losing the town. Fighting had continued through the night, and by 4:30 that morning, American paratroopers from the 3rd Battalion attacked Sainte-Mère-Église directly, moving house to house, capturing 30 German defenders and killing 11 more. In the chaos of that counterattack, Steele saw an opening. He got free. Wounded, exhausted, and still recovering from 2 hours of hanging by his own parachute lines, John Steele slipped away from his captors as American forces closed in on the town. He made his way through streets that were still being fought over, found American paratroopers he recognized, and rejoined what was left of his division. By that morning, Sainte-Mère-Église had become the first town in France liberated by the Allies. And the man who had vanished from his unit before the invasion had even properly begun was standing among the men who liberated it, alive, wounded, and very much accounted for. Steele's ordeal earned him the Bronze Star for valor and the Purple Heart for his wound. But the story of what actually happened to him during those 2 hours on the church steeple didn't become widely known until years later, when journalist Cornelius Ryan interviewed him for the 1959 book The Longest Day. The 1962 film adaptation put Steele's story on screens around the world, with actor Red Buttons playing him hanging from the church tower. A scene that turned one soldier's near-death ordeal into one of the most recognizable images of the entire Normandy invasion. To the men who had searched for him in the dark on June 6th, though, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was that Pop Steele, the oldest man in the outfit, the company barber, had made it back. Steele didn't go home after Sainte-Mère-Église. He kept fighting. He jumped again during Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, and he continued serving through the Battle of the Bulge and the final push into Germany, becoming one of a small number of paratroopers who completed all 4 major combat jumps of the 82nd Airborne in Europe. The war took his youngest brother, Norman, who was killed in Germany in April 1945, just weeks before the fighting in Europe ended. Steele came home to Illinois in September 1945. He worked various trades, eventually taking a job with an electric company, and rarely spoke about the war or the night he spent hanging from a church tower. For years, the story remained mostly a private memory, secondary in his own mind to everything else he'd lived through in nearly 2 years of combat. He returned to Sainte-Mère-Église in 1964 for a regimental reunion and was made an honorary citizen of the town he had once hung above, helpless, waiting to see if he would live or die. A mannequin in a paratrooper's uniform still hangs from that same church steeple today, put there to remember him and the men who jumped with him. John Steele died of throat cancer on May 16, 1969, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He was 56 years old. Steele's story is remembered today because of a film, but it stands for something much larger than one man's luck. On the night of June 6th, hundreds of American paratroopers were scattered by weather, enemy fire, and simple chance into places no plan had accounted for. Only a fraction of them landed anywhere near their intended drop zones. Many disappeared from their units for hours. Some disappeared for days. Some never reappeared at all. For every John Steele whose fate became a famous scene in a movie, there were nameless men whose families waited weeks or months for a telegram that told them nothing more than missing in action. Men whose true stories were pieced together only decades later, if they were pieced together at all. Steele's survival was not inevitable. It was 2 hours of stillness, a lucky decision by a German soldier to cut him down instead of leaving him for dead, and an American counterattack that arrived in time. Change any one of those details, and his name goes on a different kind of list. Somewhere over Normandy that night, a man vanished from the sky and from every record his unit could keep. For 2 hours, he existed only as a shape hanging against a church wall, Invisible to the people who loved him, unaccounted for by the army he served, he came back. Most who disappeared that night did not. Forgotten soldiers, untold stories, history remembered. If you want more forgotten stories from the Second World War, subscribe to Warbound Archives.